Richard Hale, CEO of HaleTech Manufacturing, had built his company on the promise of efficiency, fairness, and employee well-being. Over the past decade, his business had expanded from a single production facility to 10 factories nationwide, supplying electronic components to major retailers. On paper, things looked good. Profit margins were stable, and orders continued to flow in. But beneath the surface, troubling signs had begun to emerge. Reports from one of his largest factories painted a different reality: high employee turnover, increasing product defects, and growing delays in production. Worse, customer complaints about faulty items and shipping errors were on the rise, threatening HaleTech's reputation. When Richard confronted his district managers, their responses felt dismissive and rehearsed. They blamed the labor market, worker complacency, and unrealistic customer expectations. Yet something didn't sit right. If the problem was as simple as they claimed, why was only one factory struggling while others remained steady? Richard knew that he couldn't rely on reports alone. He needed to see the truth for himself. He decided to go undercover, posing as a factory worker to experience what his employees faced every day. Swapping his tailored suits for steel-toed boots and a factory uniform, he transformed into Rick Hanson, a new trainee assigned to the assembly line. No one at the factory had met him in person before, and his senior staff rarely interacted with frontline workers, making it the perfect opportunity. What he was about to uncover would shake the very foundation of his company. Richard arrived at HaleTech's Midlands factory just before dawn, blending in with the early shift workers shuffling into the building. The atmosphere was starkly different from the polished boardrooms he was used to. There was no buzz of motivation, no sign of camaraderie. Instead, there was a quiet resignation, as if everyone had already braced for another long, draining day. He followed the crowd to the break room, where workers barely exchanged greetings before grabbing their protective gear. A gruff floor supervisor named Carl Monroe approached him, clipboard in hand. "New guy, Hanson, right?" he muttered, barely looking up. Richard nodded. "You're on assembly line B, keep up, don't ask too many questions, and don't slow the line down." Without waiting for a response, Carl gestured toward the factory floor. The moment Richard stepped inside, the reality of why this facility was struggling became painfully clear. The space was cramped, dimly lit, and unbearably hot, with the whirring of outdated machines filling the air. Conveyor belts rattled and jerked, and workers moved at an exhausting pace, their hands flying over components with robotic precision. Despite the fast-moving process, defective products piled up on a side table, ignored by the supervisors who were supposed to check for quality. Richard quickly took his position at a workbench, assembling circuit boards under the sharp gaze of Luis, a veteran worker in his mid-50s. "Don't mess up," Luis muttered. "Carl doesn't like mistakes." Richard soon realized why mistakes were inevitable. The work was tedious, repetitive, and dangerously fast-paced. The factory's quotas were unrealistically high, forcing workers to either cut corners or risk falling behind. Within an hour, Richard's hands ached from twisting wires and securing delicate components. He stole glances at the others. Some moved with quiet efficiency, but most looked exhausted, their faces lined with stress. At one point, he saw a younger worker, Ethan, struggle to keep up, his fingers trembling from fatigue. "Move faster, kid, or you're out," Carl barked from across the floor. Ethan nodded quickly, eyes downcast, but Richard could see the frustration boiling beneath his quiet compliance. By midday, Richard had experienced more than enough to confirm his suspicions. This wasn't just a factory with management issues. It was a place where workers were overworked, undervalued, and fearful of speaking up. The culture was not one of teamwork but survival, and for the first time, Richard began to question how much of this had been happening under his nose all along. As the shift progressed, Richard's initial discomfort turned into deep concern. The more he observed, the clearer it became that the entire system was broken, not just a few processes or employees. Every aspect of the factory seemed designed to maximize output at the cost of worker well-being. The outdated machinery constantly jammed or misaligned, forcing workers to either waste time fixing errors or force parts into place, risking damage. When Richard asked about maintenance, Luis scoffed. "Management won't approve downtime. If something breaks, we either rig it back together or fall behind. And trust me, Carl would rather we keep going than report an issue." Richard frowned. Cutting corners on quality was a disaster waiting to happen. It wasn't just the equipment, it was the expectations placed on the workers. The quotas were unrealistic, pushing employees to skip breaks, ignore pain, and work through exhaustion just to avoid being singled out by Carl. Richard watched as Sheila, a woman in her late 40s, rubbed her wrists discreetly, trying to ease the ache from assembling parts at a relentless pace. Every time she paused, Carl would shoot her a glare, as if daring her to slow down. Ethan, the young worker Richard had noticed earlier, was struggling even more. His hands shook as he handled delicate components, and at one point he fumbled, dropping a circuit board onto the conveyor belt. The factory floor froze for a moment. Carl stormed over, snatched the defective board, and slammed it onto Ethan's workstation. "You think we've got time for screw-ups?" Carl hissed, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Maybe if you actually focused instead of slowing us all down, we wouldn't be behind schedule." Ethan's face flushed with humiliation, but he didn't argue. He simply nodded and picked up his pace, even as his fingers trembled. Richard clenched his fists. This wasn't just about productivity. This was outright intimidation. The deeper Richard looked, the more patterns he noticed. Workers covered for each other, helping where they could without drawing Carl's attention. When a conveyor belt jammed, Miguel, another senior employee, quickly fixed it without calling a technician, a clear sign that they weren't allowed to report problems without facing backlash. Complaints went ignored, and requests for better equipment were brushed off. The few who tried to speak up either quit or were pushed out. By the end of the shift, Richard felt drained, both physically and mentally. He had expected inefficiencies, but he hadn't expected to find a workplace ruled by fear. He had built HaleTech on the belief that employees were its greatest asset, but standing in that factory, surrounded by exhausted, overworked, and undervalued workers, he realized just how far that vision had strayed. One thing was certain: this wasn't a leadership problem confined to Carl. This was a company-wide failure, and it was time to fix it. By the middle of his second shift, Richard had reached his breaking point. He had spent another grueling day on the factory floor, watching Carl bark orders, belittle workers, and refuse to address basic operational issues. The final straw came during the afternoon rush, when a major equipment failure brought the entire line to a halt. The conveyor system jammed again, this time beyond a quick fix, and instead of following safety protocols, Carl forced employees to manually move heavy components, bypassing critical safety procedures. Richard saw Miguel and Ethan struggling to lift a stack of metal casings, their arms shaking under the weight, but Carl stood off to the side, arms crossed, sneering. "Hurry up. We don't have all day," Carl snapped. No offer to help, no acknowledgement of the risk, just blind pressure to get the job done. Miguel gritted his teeth and kept pushing, but Ethan's grip slipped. One of the metal casings clattered to the ground, narrowly missing his foot. Carl immediately pounced. "You incompetent idiot," Carl bellowed, striding toward Ethan. "Do you have any idea what that costs us? Maybe if you weren't so damn slow, you wouldn't be screwing up left and right." Richard stepped forward instinctively, his heart pounding. He had seen enough. "Back off, Carl," Richard said sharply, his voice cutting through the factory noise like a blade. Carl turned, his usual smug expression briefly flickering with surprise before he laughed. "Oh, so the rookie's got a mouth on him now." He folded his arms, looking Richard up and down. "You got a problem with how I run things?" Richard held his ground. "Yeah, I do. You're endangering your team, ignoring safety, and treating your best workers like garbage. This isn't management, it's bullying." And Carl's face darkened. "Listen, rookie, you don't get to tell me how to run my floor. If you don't like it, there's the door." Richard exhaled slowly, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his company ID. The laminated card, embossed with the HaleTech logo, glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights as he held it up for everyone to see. "My name is Richard Hale," he said, his voice steady. "I own this company." The entire factory floor fell silent. Carl went pale, his arms dropping to his sides. Miguel and Sheila exchanged wide-eyed glances. Ethan looked between Richard and Carl, clearly stunned. "I've been working here undercover for the past 2 days," Richard continued, his tone now deadly calm. "And what I've seen is unacceptable." He turned toward the workers, scanning their exhausted, wary faces. The mistreatment, the lack of safety, the fear. That stops today. Carl stammered, trying to regain control. "Look, Mr. Hale, You're fired," Richard cut in, his voice firm, effective immediately. Carl's jaw tightened, his arrogance slipping into desperation. "Wait, hold on. I don't need excuses," Richard interrupted. "I need leaders who actually support their teams, and you are not one of them." Carl stood frozen, his lips pressing into a thin line. Then, without another word, he spun on his heel and stormed toward the exit. As the door slammed shut behind him, the factory floor erupted into murmurs. Some workers looked relieved. Others still seemed too stunned to believe what had just happened. Richard turned back to them. "This isn't just about Carl," he said. "This is about making sure none of you ever have to work under someone like that again. We're changing things, starting now." And for the first time since he stepped onto that factory floor, he saw something in the workers' eyes that hadn't been there before. Hope. As the factory floor settled from the shock of Carl's abrupt departure, Richard turned his full attention to the workers. He could see the mixture of relief, disbelief, and lingering uncertainty in their faces. Some stood frozen near their stations while others exchanged hushed whispers, trying to process what had just happened. Miguel adjusted his work gloves, his jaw clenched as if he was bracing for what would come next. Sheila rubbed her wrist absent-mindedly, a habit Richard now recognized as the result of years of pushing through pain without support. Ethan, still shaken from Carl's outburst, looked as though he wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or anxious about what was coming next. Richard took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I know this is a lot to take in," he began, his voice steady but firm. "I didn't come here as your CEO to catch people making mistakes. I came here because I needed to see for myself what's really happening inside this factory." He gestured around at the equipment, the worn-out machinery, the workers still standing tensely, waiting for the next blow to fall. "What I've seen over the last few days isn't just a management issue. It's a complete failure of leadership. And that's on me." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Workers exchanged glances, clearly not expecting the CEO himself to take responsibility. Richard continued, his voice laced with conviction. "This factory was built on the idea that our people are our greatest asset, but somewhere along the way we lost sight of that. I trusted reports and numbers instead of listening to the people who keep this place running. That changes today." Sheila crossed her arms, skeptical. "And how do we know things will actually change?" she asked, her voice laced with exhaustion and doubt. Richard met her gaze. "Because I'm not just here to talk. I'm here to act." He turned to Miguel. "You and your team have been keeping this factory together despite broken equipment and impossible conditions. That ends now. Effective immediately, we're allocating funding for new machinery, safer tools, and proper maintenance protocols. No more making do with outdated equipment that puts you at risk." Miguel's eyes widened. "You mean it?" Richard nodded. "I do." Then he turned to Ethan. "You've been taking heat from customers because of slow turnaround times caused by these inefficiencies. We're fixing that by hiring more workers and restructuring shifts to ensure no one is overworked or left struggling alone." Ethan exhaled in visible relief. Finally, Richard addressed the entire team. "From today forward, we're implementing a direct feedback system, anonymously if needed, so no one feels unheard. Leadership will be held accountable, and this will never happen again." For the first time since he arrived, he saw the tension in the room begin to lift. Miguel nodded, Sheila's expression softened, and Ethan let out a breath he had probably been holding for months. It was a start, and this time Richard would make sure it wasn't just words, it was action. The factory, once a place filled with exhaustion and silent resentment, was about to experience a transformation. Richard knew that words alone weren't enough. Real action had to follow immediately. As soon as the meeting ended, he called a private session with his senior leadership team, including Linda, the factory's general manager. Sitting across from her in the conference room, he didn't waste time. "We need a new plan, starting today. The way this factory has been operating is unacceptable, and I take responsibility for that. But now, I need you to step up and help me fix it." Linda, still shaken from the day's events, nodded slowly, her usual confident demeanor replaced by a nervous edge. Richard outlined his first set of immediate changes. First, Carl is gone. His management style was toxic, and I won't allow anyone else to abuse or intimidate employees. That kind of leadership has no place here. Linda hesitated, but ultimately agreed. I should have stepped in sooner, she admitted. I let the numbers blind me to what was really happening on the floor. Richard acknowledged her honesty, but made it clear that accountability was key. You're on probation, he said. If I don't see significant improvements in leadership and workplace morale over the next 3 months, we'll need to discuss your future here. Linda swallowed hard, but nodded, accepting the challenge. Next came structural changes. Richard immediately approved budget increases for new equipment, safety upgrades, and better maintenance schedules. Workers like Miguel, who had been struggling with unreliable machines, would no longer have to patch things together with temporary fixes. The first shipment of new machinery will be here within 2 weeks, Richard announced at a second team meeting that afternoon. A ripple of surprise passed through the employees. After years of complaints being ignored, their concerns were finally being taken seriously. But Richard wasn't done. He addressed the issue of overwhelming workloads. Starting next month, we'll be hiring additional staff and adjusting shift structures to ensure a fairer distribution of work, he told the team. No more 12-hour days just to meet unrealistic quotas. Ethan, who had been pushed to the brink at the customer service desk, let out a relieved sigh. Finally, he muttered under his breath, but Richard caught it and nodded. To ensure accountability, Richard introduced a direct feedback system. Employees could now report concerns anonymously, and all complaints would go directly to senior management, bypassing any untrustworthy supervisors. If you ever feel like you're being mistreated or ignored, I want to hear about it, Richard promised. As the day wrapped up, Richard pulled aside Sheila, Miguel, and Ethan. You've kept this place going despite everything stacked against you, he said sincerely. You're not just employees. You're the backbone of this company. You deserve recognition. Each of them received a pay raise and a bonus for their dedication. For the first time in a long time, there was hope in the factory. The toxic leadership was being removed, real changes were being implemented, and employees finally felt valued. Richard knew the road ahead would be long, but the most important step had already been taken. Change had begun. 2 weeks after Richard's undercover mission and the sweeping changes he implemented, the factory was almost unrecognizable. The tension that had once filled the air like an oppressive weight was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose and teamwork. Walking onto the factory floor unannounced, Richard immediately noticed the difference. Workers who had once shuffled through their shifts in exhausted silence were now engaged, talking and even laughing as they worked. The production lines, previously plagued with delays due to faulty machinery, now ran smoothly with the newly installed equipment. Safety protocols had been reinforced, and instead of people dodging potential hazards, they worked efficiently without fear of broken machinery or unrealistic quotas looming over them. Linda had stepped up as a leader in a way Richard hadn't expected. She was no longer hiding behind spreadsheets and quotas, but actively engaging with employees, checking in with workers individually, and making sure they had the support they needed. Watching from a distance, Richard saw her stop by Miguel's station, listening attentively as he explained how the new lift system had reduced strain on the workers. It's saving time and saving our backs, Miguel said, giving her an approving nod. Linda smiled, taking notes, something she wouldn't have done before. Sheila had been moved to a less physically demanding role, just as Richard had promised. When he approached her, she beamed. I can actually sleep at night without my wrist throbbing, she told him. I didn't think anyone cared enough to make these changes. Richard smiled. You mattered to this company long before these changes. You just weren't being heard. Even Ethan, who had struggled under an overwhelming workload at the customer service desk, looked like a new person. With an extra team member now supporting him, customer complaints had decreased significantly, and he no longer spent his shifts trying to put out fires. When Richard approached, Ethan grinned. You know, he said, I was this close to quitting before all this. Now, it actually feels like a place I want to be. For Richard, this visit confirmed what he had hoped. The changes weren't just temporary fixes. They were creating a new culture. The factory wasn't perfect, but it was moving in the right direction. Employees felt valued, leaders were being held accountable, and for the first time in years, it felt like the company was finally living up to the values it had once claimed to stand for. As Richard stepped out of the factory that afternoon, he took a deep breath, letting the transformation sink in. Just weeks ago, this place had been a symbol of everything wrong with leadership: disengaged management, overworked employees, and a culture of fear and resentment. Now, it was a workplace that thrived on teamwork, respect, and accountability. But Richard knew this was only the beginning. Real change wasn't about making one-time fixes. It was about setting a new standard, one that would last long after his visit. Back in his office, he reflected on what this experience had taught him. He had spent years relying on reports, financial statements, and the word of upper management to gauge success, never realizing how disconnected he had become from the reality on the ground. Numbers might show profit, but they never tell the full story of what happens in the daily lives of employees. It was clear now that leadership wasn't about sitting in a high-rise office making decisions from a distance. It was about being present, listening, and taking action where it mattered most. Determined to prevent this from happening again, Richard put new policies in place: quarterly undercover visits across all company locations, an anonymous employee feedback system, and mandatory leadership training for all managers. He vowed that no worker in his company would ever be left unheard again. As he watched the factory from his office window, Richard felt something he hadn't in a long time: a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about fixing a failing factory, it was about rebuilding the company's soul. And with the right leadership, the right values, and the right people, he knew they were on the right path to a better future. The story of Richard's undercover experience highlights a crucial lesson in leadership. True success isn't just about financial growth, but about the people who make it possible. For too long, Richard relied on reports and upper management to gauge the health of his company, only to realize that numbers don't reflect the real struggles of employees. His factory had been running on fear, overwork, and poor leadership, and it took first-hand experience for him to see the damage being done. This experience taught Richard that leadership is about presence, accountability, and action. A company's culture starts from the top, and when leaders become disconnected, problems fester. Employees don't just need orders, they need support, fair treatment, and a workplace where they feel valued. By stepping into their world, Richard learned that policies and quotas mean nothing if they come at the expense of morale and well-being. His transformation as a leader didn't just improve one factory, it set a new precedent for how his entire company would operate. The lesson? True leadership isn't about control, it's about empowerment. When employees thrive, the business thrives, and that's a principle no successful leader should ever forget.